Even as hollow shells, they will continue to evolve, and each time they will grow wings and fly too close to the sun. It is their nature. When examining Omocat's horror game phenomena, OMORI, from a psychoanalytical perspective, it becomes apparent that the sprawling subconscious world of Headspace and its various layers explored by Sunny's alternative self, OMORI, are more than just a random assortment of memories and emotions. Rather, these environments serve to symbolize Sunny's own ego, an ego stemming from the ambivalence between his innate desires to rekindle the friendship and love he once had, his id, and the moral disgust and fear he has of his own actions, his superego. A conflict which results in a compromise of pure escapism. Subsequently, it is through this symbolism of the ego which allows Omocat to complicate the idea of trauma, mainly how it affects the human ego. Trauma is demonstrated to be a virtually insurmountable force against the ego, inevitably overriding, corrupting, and damaging it until the mind is irreparably damaged and destroyed, or the very source of trauma is expunged. The escapism of the ego is entirely but ineffective against the immensity of the deep-seated trauma. Only when directly confronted can it be overcome. OMORI is a psychological horror game that focuses on the life of Sunny and, more importantly, the realization of his grim past. Throughout the game, players explore two main settings as the primary events unfold, that being Headspace, the dreams of Sunny, and Faraway Town, the real-world equivalent in the narrative. While Faraway Town is fairly straightforward in its presentation, Headspace is far more complex in that it is far more expansive and composed of multiple consciousness layers of sorts. Throughout the majority of the game, players will indulge in the fantastical quest of Headspace as an alternative version of Sunny known as OMORI, a younger, more outgoing iteration of himself. While exploring the colorful Headspace regions, small snippets of the truth about Sunny's past is revealed to the player through the permeation of Blackspace, the deepest layer of Headspace composed of gruesome and monstrous imagery centric around the figure of something and its various forms. Something being the distorted perception of Sunny's sister, Mari, hanging corpse. Eventually, the culmination of these clues above Blackspace result in the realization that Sunny had experienced the trauma of killing Mari in an accident 4 years ago and has tried to bury the trauma through Headspace ever since. Prior to analyzing the true nature of trauma and how it is defined as an inescapable and all-consuming force within the narrative, one must first direct their attention towards the fantastical world of Headspace and its iterations, mainly the ways in which it is demonstrated to be the ego of Sunny. In the first layer of Headspace, referred to as Whitespace, it is but an empty, white void with nothing but a singular room placed directly in its center. This place is described by OMORI as an emptiness, a home without warmth, a place to survive, but not to live. As shown, this space provides an apparent means of escapism and avoidance for Sunny, as it is nothing but pure emptiness. It lacks any ounce of emotion whatsoever in its presentation, hence a home without warmth. There is no color, no stimuli, and no feeling to be found in this space, making it but a hollow shell of reality, a purposeless existence that provides only survival, not life. Whitespace being devoid of every component there is to human life, devoid of any warmth, love, nostalgia, affection, allows for Sunny to properly isolate himself from any potential reminders of his trauma and inherent disgust for his own wrongdoings, superego, whilst also providing him with his supposed physiological needs as mentioned through a place to survive, his id. This form of escapism in turn creates a manifestation of ego, seeming as it stems from a compromise between the superego and id of Sunny himself, the need to distance himself from his moral wrongs, and the innate desires for humans to merely exist. Moreover, the white space also satiates the id desire for safety. Through this escapism, as John Sledvold states in his article, Freud's Three Theories of Neurosis towards a Contemporary Theory of Trauma and Defense. However, In common hysteria, many years will often separate the traumatic event from the outbreak of the hysterical symptom, and they conclude hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. Since Whitespace is stripped of all and every emotion, there is no plausible way for any triggers of the traumatic incident to persist. No ways for Sonny to remember any of those feelings associated with the trauma, thereby meaning that there is no way for him to suffer from the painful reminiscences in an emptiness of white space, this nothingness providing a safeguard against his own emotion. This idea of ego is further built upon in The Ego and Id Revisited, Freud and Damasio on the body ego/self, which states he builds an argument from the assumption that the origin of the ego is to be found in the primordial feelings or internal perceptions of the emotional state of the body. Essentially, Freud argues that the ego is derived from the innate feelings of man in addition to the emotional state of the body, insinuating that a conflicting perceived state of emotion would result in a compromised ego that is fragmented across various feelings. Through this, it becomes apparent that Whitespace must be an iteration of Sonny's own ego, or at least a part of it, due to the fact that it stems from the primordial feeling to survive, as well as the conflicting emotional states of wanting to escape and isolate from the trauma and moral wrongdoings, whilst also wanting a safe space to persist in. A home, as described above. A space where everything is nothing and nothing is everything. The conflicting mental and emotional states of his superego, morality, and id, safety and survival, are the main elements that comprise the ego of Whitespace, a hollow and yet safe existence free of moral reminders of the deep-seated trauma from all those years ago. Headspace itself, on the other hand, is an extension of Whitespace that primarily relies on nostalgia and distraction in order to provide escapism, the framework of Sonny's ego. These ideas are built upon by every facet of the setting within the various areas of Headspace, from the expansive forest to the looming castle. However, it is no more apparent than in the very starting level of the game, named Neighbor's Room. As Omori steps into the room, he is greeted by a host of toys scattered messily across the floor. Highly saturated colors and extravagant imagery such as a looming, bright yellow cartoon cat holding onto the wall, as Aubrey, one of his friends, asks him if he wants to join them in playing a game of cards. As shown, Headspace invokes strong feelings of nostalgia and fantastical whimsy through symbols of childhood and joy. The neighbor's room is purposely shown to be messy and disorganized in order to further the feeling of nostalgia, seeing as the mess correlates to the lack of care and freedom inherent to being a child, the carefree nature of the blissful ignorance that is inherent to all those who are still young, exacerbating the nostalgia. Furthermore, the highly saturated colors that utterly drench the room also further the joy aspect of Headspace, seeing as higher saturations, brighter colors, are inherently linked to heightened feelings of happiness and bliss that, in combination with the nostalgic imagery, provide the perfect artificial environment for Sonny to distract and escape the troubles of his own miserable trauma. It serves as a perfect means of escapism. However, the most important aspect of the scene was the inclusion of his friends that he no longer has contact with in the real world, at least at this point in the game. It is through all of these various inclusions within Headspace that cause it to become the ego of Sonny himself, seeing as it compromises between his innate need to distance himself from his moral wrongdoings, his superego, and satiate the love that he has been deprived of for many, many years, the love of his friends that he has lost, his id. The distractions of nostalgia and artificially induced positive emotions provide a means of escapism for Sonny, just as Whitespace had. Escapism that serves as a compromise between his superego and id, thereby defining Headspace as yet another form of his own ego. These two vastly different settings, however, are still intertwined in the larger whole of Sonny's own trauma-induced ego. As stated in You've Been Living Here for As Long As You Can Remember, Trauma in Omori's Environmental Design, Headspace provides a type of escapism that is fundamentally different from that of Whitespace. but it still aims to achieve the same end result of distancing Omori from his traumatic memories. As shown, both of these subconscious spaces are integral to Sunny's own escapism from himself and his trauma. They both achieve the same effect despite their vastly different elements. Therefore, in their similar effects of escapism, they are shown to both be a part of Sunny's own ego, seeing as the underlying ambivalence between his innate desires for love and safety and the superego disgust of himself and his own morality stemming from the traumatic incident culminates into the solution of escapism. A solution that is able to compromise for these conflicting emotional states, satiating both of them through the respective forms of escapism seen in Whitespace and Headspace. Furthermore, not only do they provide the same emotional and mental effects through various concepts, but the very nature of their existence also links them both as segments of Sunny's own ego, as elaborated in The Ego and Id Revisited, Freud and Damasio on the Body, Ego/Self, which states, not only was Freud able to conceive the ego as the perception and feeling of her own body, but also to conceive the knowing, the mental life of another by means of recreating the bodily state of another through imitation. As shown, an ego is not simply just the existing bodily and mentally state of an individual themselves, rather, it can also be completely fabricated, an imitation as stated. An individual's ego has the ability to lie, to present falsities for the sake of the mental state. Both Headspace and Whitespace are mere imitations of the real world, reflecting the conflicting mental states of Sunny during different points of his life. Whitespace's emptiness reflecting the isolation and emptiness that Sunny feels in the present, whilst the childish glee and nostalgia of Headspace reflects the blissfully ignorant mind of young Sunny before the traumatic incident, before his life and his friend group had fell apart. Headspace and Whitespace are one and the same. The expansive ego of Sunny spawned from the need to escape the truth, his trauma. Beneath the monotonous, safe nothingness of Whitespace and the vibrant, whimsical worlds of friendly Headspace, however, is the delirium and hysteria-filled void known as Blackspace, the complete inverse to that of Whitespace. Blackspace is the incarnate form of Sunny's repressed trauma, along with any of the somethings that lie within it. The Blackspace's manifestation of the embodiment of trauma is best demonstrated through the discussion from Eunice and Fed, and You've Been Living Here for as Long as You Can Remember, Trauma in Omori's Environmental Design, which describes Blackspace as entirely themed after the horrific creatures and memories expelled by Headspace, thrusting players into a space completely characterized by the abject without Headspace's projective measures for the first time. As shown, Blackspace is characterized by the presence of all the entities that were violently dispelled from the ego of Sunny prior within the journey, the presence of something permeating through every shadow of the inky, disjointed abyss of the fragmented areas. Something, as mentioned earlier, is the monstrous form of Mari's corpse, a direct symbol of the traumatizing sight Sunny had seen when he looked back, the most distinguishing source of all this repressed trauma held from that day. Therefore, to have this entity placed all throughout the area to the point where it becomes the underlying theme for this whole section, and an entity which is inherently linked to the source of the trauma and is continuously expelled from the ego created to combat the trauma, is to effectively perpetuate the idea that Blackspace as a whole is the unconscious embodiment of Sunny's repressed trauma. Blackspace is the trauma in its purest form because it harbors that which pervades the protective measures of Headspace the most. Something. Furthermore, the layout and structure of Blackspace also contributes towards its direct symbolism of the trauma that Sunny had continuously repressed through Headspace for all these years, through its inherent disorientation. Before discussing the layout, it is important to note that when examining trauma and its effects, the idea of disassociation becomes all the more apparent. In the article, Linking the Overwhelming with the Unbearable, Developmental Trauma, Disassociation, and Disconnected Self, it states, in this case, disassociation may paradoxically protect the traumatized child from the fragmentation of the self through multiple disconnections in the self, occurring at both mental and bodily levels. As shown, trauma and disassociation are interdependent. They are inherent to one another in their perpetuation. Traumatized individuals will fragment their own mental state across various disconnections, complicating the perception of the self to a great extent. This in turn insinuates that those who confront their own trauma will inevitably face their own fragmentation, their disjointed perception of self, thereby meaning that the disorientation and confusion are bound to trauma. One will inevitably feel lost and confused when reflecting upon their own trauma through their fragmentation of disassociation, a phenomenon that is only exacerbated in children as stated above. This idea is exemplified through the very layout of Blackspace, to which is effectively summarized as, "You've been living here for as long as you can remember. Trauma and OMORI's environmental design," when it writes, "Raft area is entirely colored in high contrasting blacks and whites, while neighbor area mimics Headspace's design in its bright and colorful palette. Similarly, beach area and disco area feature muted and low contrast color palettes, while spider area and faceless area feature extremely saturated tones contrasted against a pitch black background." As shown, each of these various clusters of Blackspace, memories of the trauma, are encoded with vastly different color sets in order to disassociate each area from another, to maximize the difference between each main section of Blackspace. By making the areas of Blackspace as different from each other as possible, incorporating vastly different palettes to each and every area, it in turn heightened the sense of disorientation that players, and by extension OMORI, will feel traversing Blackspace, as the cohesiveness of the setting is virtually eradicated through these polar opposite rooms. Disorientation that mimics the fragmentation inflicted by real-life trauma. Though they belong to the same overarching space, the rooms feel as if they're almost in different realities of sorts through their mismatched color palettes, minimizing the cohesiveness of Blackspace as a whole and in turn exemplifying it as the embodiment of the trauma and trauma itself. Trauma is defined as an insurmountable force against the ineffective escapism of the ego through the various ways in which Blackspace interacts with Headspace, how trauma interacts with the means to escape it. One of the most apparent instances of this phenomena is seen while OMORI traverses the deep well, the lowest level of Headspace and thereby the closest to Blackspace. A mysterious voice from above telling him, "Although they are revived time and time again, the most haunting stay in this world, even if only their bones remain." This extract from the dialogue highlights the fact that if this was not the first iteration of Headspace, that this was not the first time OMORI and his friends have traversed the whimsical lands. By stating that they were revived time and time again, it insinuates the fact that Headspace and all of those in it have been reset, for lack of a better term, countless times, that the world has been destroyed because of the haunting that continues to persist. This in turn perpetuates the idea that Headspace, even through all of its safety nets to expunge the truth, his trauma, Sonny has been forced to reconstruct his headspace, his ego, from the ground up countless times over the past 4 years just to hold back the encroaching Blackspace, the persistent haunting of his unconscious mind. The fact that he must reset his ego to protect himself from the trauma countless times alludes to the idea that the haunting, Blackspace, will inevitably come to infect Headspace through each cycle, that OMORI will never be able to fully escape his Blackspace, his trauma, no matter how many times he revives his friends, even if only the bones remain. This inevitability of the realization of the haunting serves to further the idea that the ego and the escapism it provides are all but futile against the repression of trauma. That Headspace is not enough to hold back the persistent and overwhelming tides of Blackspace, the congregated essence of trauma inflicting Sonny. This idea of the persistent of the haunting is further elaborated upon in Linking the Overwhelming with the Unbearable, Developmental Trauma, Disassociation, and the Disconnected Self, which states, "Disassociation links the overwhelming with the unbearable, and inextricably binds the experiences of abuse, neglect, and disrupted communication with attachment figures during childhood with the development of the unbearable self-experiences that cannot be integrated into the consciousness and therefore continue to disturb the individual throughout his or her entire life. It is this final mention of the lifetime suffering that alludes to the idea that trauma does not simply vanish over time. It does not dissipate on its own. Rather, the effects and fragmentation of the experience inflict permanent mental disruptions and ailments on the individual for their entire life through continuous disturbances. The disassociation of the self from traumatic childhood experiences is pertinacious, continuously afflicting the mind of the affected individual until the source of the unbearable is dealt with, is overcome, lest they live a lifetime of disturbances. This in turn demonstrates that trauma is pervasive against the ego, seeing as its disturbances will affect the individual throughout his or her entire life, lest it is dealt with directly. Just as Sonny was forced to continuously repress his trauma, his Blackspace, through the continuous reconstruction of Headspace, the continuous revival of his friends, and the world that constitutes the safeguard that is his ego. Perhaps the most straightforward representation of this phenomena, however, is found within the penultimate battle of the game and the two main outcomes that may occur. As Sonny enters Whitespace for the last time, he is greeted with his alternate self, OMORI, who draws a knife on him as they engage in conflict. Amidst the conflict, OMORI begins to grow distorted and glitched, whilst Whitespace falls apart and transforms into a blood-red hellscape filled with hands. This extended scene demonstrates not only the ineffectiveness of escapism against the consuming power of trauma, but also the total deconstruction of the ego. The distortions on OMORI allude to the distortions inherent to that of Blackspace, its rooms utilizing technical glitches to represent the inherent distortion and of the dissociation of trauma and its lasting fragmentation of the self, thereby meaning that OMORI himself in this moment is symbolic of the culminating Blackspace in humanoid form. The transformation of Whitespace into a red-filled horror-inducing area, as mentioned before, represents the fact that Blackspace, OMORI, in this moment, has deconstructed Whitespace and its inherent safety, turning it into the very embodiment of the fear and horror that constitute trauma. These feelings perpetuated by the generous use of reds all throughout the background, the monotonous but emotionless whites that provided the necessary escapism of Sonny's ego, were completely destroyed by the mere presence of trauma in this space, by the permeation of Blackspace through OMORI in these final moments as Sonny aims to conquer the source of the trauma once and for all. The retreat that Whitespace provided was converted into the heart of pain and hatred of the self, as demonstrated through the harsh red splattered across the remnants of what used to be pure nothingness, proving that escapism is not effective at disrupting and combating trauma, that the ego known as Whitespace could not resist against the inescapable and incomprehensible powers of Blackspace, and the unbridled trauma that is instilled in OMORI in this moment, completely disconstructing the Sonny's ego as he confronts his Blackspace head-on. Following this battle, if Sonny successfully defeats OMORI, it shows Sonny waking up in a hospital, roaming its empty halls until he eventually reaches his friend's room, finally telling them the truth of what happened on that fateful day his sister died. However, as he smiles at Basil, the only friend who knows of the truth, something is seen dissipating behind him. The dissolving of something in this true ending of the game works to signify the eradication of Blackspace, and by extension the conquering of his repressed trauma. The only ending in the game where something is actually shown to be destroyed is in the ending where Sonny faces his trauma head-on. The ending where Sonny stops trying to escape it through Headspace and Whitespace and confronts Blackspace completely through his own willpower. The mere fact that this is the only ending where something disappears, the haunting trauma of his sister's death, in combination with the context leading up to this ending, works to demonstrate the inescapability of trauma. The idea that trauma can only be truly destroyed through acknowledgement, not escapism. Sonny acknowledges what he did to his sister in its entirety in this moment by telling his friends the truth, and consequently, something leaves. Blackspace dies. As stated in Freud's three theories of neurosis towards a contemporary theory of trauma and defense, it depends on the affected individual's ability to cope with the events. The elimination and alleviation of trauma can only be achieved through the proper coping mechanisms, thereby insinuating that once more, escapism and avoidance are all but ineffective at truly ridding oneself of their own black space, of finally getting rid of their own something. Unless one gains the ability to cope with the traumatic experience, to acknowledge and accept its occurrence, something will continue to follow them for the rest of their days. Their trauma will never cease to plague their headspace, just as it never did for Sonny, until he walked into that hospital room with all his friends, until he accepted it. The sprawling and distinct environments that inhabit Omori extend beyond just the simple dreams and fantasies spawned from the imagination of a recluse. They tell a story of the nature of trauma and escapism. Headspace and by extension Whitespace demonstrate the ego stemming from a traumatized individual. An ego of imitation and distraction meant to serve as nothing but a safeguard against the all-consuming black space and its monstrous somethings that pervade through the crevices of Sonny's unconscious mind. An ego ravaged by the reminiscences of a foregone truth deeply embedded within Sonny's being. Through this, Omocat is able to effectively demonstrate just how pervasive trauma it really is, and by extension, just how futile the ego is in its wake. The only way for Sonny to fully overcome this black space, to overcome his deep-seated trauma, is not to escape it through headspace for the rest of his days, resetting countless times in a cyclic path to nowhere, but to stand tall and face the truth with wide open arms. No matter how far you push your feelings down, they'll always come back somehow. And what you do with those feelings, that will be your truth.